Okay. Welcome, everybody. Sorry we're running a little bit behind schedule. So we'll get out of here around 9:30, 10.
I might yawn a little bit.
This is one of my favorites. I didn't wear my flat earth hoodie today. I should have. I'll wear it before these sessions are over. But tonight we're going to talk about science and thinking well, particularly about reading Scripture. The main thing about this is that it takes effort to study Scripture, and a lot of times I think that in a lot of circles the effort's sort of downplayed. That somehow we just sort of receive it and pick it up and know it, and there's an element there which is theologically true that discernment through the Holy Spirit plays a role, but He doesn't bypass the faculties He gave us, which is basically using our brains, and not just our brains, but our bodies. I mean, there's a lot of effort and there's a lot of practice involved with being a disciple of Jesus, but when it comes to Scripture, you get what you put into it. And so this session tonight, and this should be session 3, not session 2. Gosh, there's always something in there. I'll get that fixed. It was session 2 last time. What we're going to discuss tonight is learning how to interpret your Bible in its own context and knowing exactly what to do with it once you do that. And one of the things about Scripture is that it is written in a pre-scientific world. It should be kind of obvious, but for a guy like me that was in seminary reading Genesis 1, and here I am in my head trying to figure out a way to make it fit or force it to fit some sort of cosmology that I understood, whether it would be a 6-day literal creation or a day age or whatever it was, and I kind of went through the gambit. And again, Heiser helped me with this, basically said, they're not writing you a science lesson. It's meant to communicate theological truths about God and about the universe He created and the people in it. And so whenever you take that approach, it necessarily causes you to sort of look at it with different eyes and basically sort of stripping it down to what it actually is instead of placing layer upon layer of our own context on top of the text itself. So we'll start there, and then we'll get into truth and relativism. And basically at the end of this is the last of the 3. The first one we talked about a historical context. The second one we talked about the literary context. This one is sort of a cap on the first half of it, which is basically talking about science, talking about thinking well, and what we're doing here. And we're going to do a real live example of that with Genesis 1 and 2, actually 1, 2, and 3, with Adam and Eve, is a face value, plain reading of the text. Let's not sneak John MacArthur into it. Let's not sneak, John Wesley into it, or the Gospel Coalition. Let's read the text. What does it say? What does it not say? What can we conclude from it? So we're going to end on that note. And at the last one here, alienation from nature and God, I will come out front and tell you this is my material here towards the end. Hopefully it'll make sense. And if it doesn't, you got me to blame for it. So let's go ahead and get started with science in the Bible. We're going to talk about cosmology. We're going to talk about biology, reproduction, and seems like there was one more thing. But we're going to find out pretty fast that whenever you're dealing with Scripture, whether it's in the Old Testament or the New Testament, we're talking about people that did not understand genetics. You will not find any references to genes or DNA in the Bible. And it's too easy. The reason why I say it sounds kind of obvious, but there's a whole new class of folks out there, and I don't want to discourage it, but they get into the supernatural view of Genesis 6 and the Nephilim, and then they talk about mixed breeds and stuff like that, gene splicing. You're not going to find that in the Old Testament. You're not going to find it. It's not there. What you're doing when you do that is you're reading your own context and your own knowledge about things they had no clue about and reading, placing it on top of the text. Now, there's a lot of weirder stuff, like the fact that supernatural beings could take on a physical appearance and do things that a human body could do. That's weird enough as it is. So we don't need to be dragging DNA and quantum mechanics and stuff like that into the text as well. Let's let it just speak for itself. When it comes to cosmology, I think it might be surprised, those of you who were here last semester or last session, we did this. This is going to be a review. But for those who hadn't, you're going to find out that the ancient mind and the ancient Near East had a very specific view of cosmology, a view of how the universe is all laid out. And it was very different from our own. And the best way to try to describe how they came up with their cosmology makes tons of sense, because you don't have rockets, you don't have powerful telescopes. So how do you come up with your cosmology if you're in ancient Egypt? Well, you walk outside and you look around and you try to describe what you're seeing, and your cosmology is going to be driven that direction. So, fast forward to the 21st century, when we read that, we know a lot more that they didn't. But you can't really blame them for being dumb, for being that way, because if you think about it, walking outside and trying to describe the night sky and how it relates to the earth that you're walking on is actually a pretty inventive, pretty creative way of trying to describe the universe you're living in. So, I mean, it's wrong to try to put into their heads things that aren't in their heads, but it's also wrong to consider them less sophisticated than we are, just because they don't understand the things we do either. There are different types of creation stories in the ancient Near East. In Egypt, for example, we have different stories depending on if you're going to Memphis or if you're going to some of the other ancient Egyptian cities. They had their own creation story. Now, there's a lot of overlap to them. But it seems like that a lot of the Egyptian views of cosmology sort of match the way they designed their temple. This is a picture of a typical Egyptian temple from one of the dynasties, maybe all three of the dynasties. But as you see, you walk in through the big front doors and it goes from really tall, and as the further in you go, the more holy it is, and the closer confines there are, till you get to the very, very end. And that's where you're going to find the idol of the god that temple's made for. If you go to the rest of the ancient Near East, you're not going to see that. You're going to see ziggurats. Everything's going to look like a layered cake that comes to a point. In Egypt, it's different. And actually, Egypt coincides more with the Hebrew temple than the rest of the ancient Near East temples did. So I think that gives a lot of credence to the fact that Egypt had a huge influence on the Israelites, even more so than the rest of the ancient Near East. So, didn't spend a lot of time on Egypt, but this is sort of an illustration of Sumerian cosmology. The Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonian Amorites, the Assyrians, all pretty much kind of had very similar cosmology, and a lot of that kind of made their way into their religious writings and their religious views. in this picture right here, they have, it's sort of like imagine a dish. So Earth is a dish, and you have the oceans in there and so forth. But at the edges of the dish, you have like a dome or other heavens. And in those heavens is where you go through layers. The first is the clouds, and then you have the stars and the moon, and then you have the lesser gods, and then above them are the major gods. Now, in Sumerian, and I think maybe even in Akkadian and Assyrian, the lesser gods were called Igigi, and the major gods were called Anunnaki. So Enki or Ea would be, Ea is probably a better one, would be Anunnaki, one of the higher gods. But see, gods were like families in their mythology because they would have kids, and they would have little god kids, the Igigi. And so the major gods were all sort of identified with forces of nature, like the sun or the earth and the heavens. And then the Igigi were more specific to like human activities like hunting or agriculture or reproduction or war. Sometimes they'd overlap. And so what they did is they designed their universe basically under this sort of view. Now, there's also below the earth, they have what they call the Apsu. And the Apsu is sort of like chaotic dark waters, primordial chaotic dark waters. Sort of like when you think of Genesis 1, whenever it says, the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the deep. Well, even the terminology there for deep to home comes from it's a cousin to another word that would have related more to like Tiamat, or a god of the chaos waters. So you had Upper Earth, you had the Apsu, and then you had the Netherworld. And the Netherworld is really pretty much where all the dead go. It's a little bit different in the terms that in a lot of these other cosmologies, you have the Upper Earth, you have the realm of the dead, and then below that you have an equivalent to the Apsu. Oh, one more thing is that, particularly in the Hebrew one, we'll get to it, there's also like pillars, heavenly pillars that sort of hold everything up. And they usually identified those with mountains. So it's kind of easy to see how you can eventually equate mountains and deity. Where does the deity reside? Who resides on the mountains? The Babylonian view of the cosmos, there you see a ziggurat basically in the center. So, really you're looking at the center of the universe is the temple for the god. And that in a lot of these, you have this multi-layered, think of a layered cake, but you have this center fulcrum that goes all the way down from top to bottom. And in a lot of ancient Near Eastern religions, they would call that the cosmic tree. Trees, and you remember we talked about this in the literary context, trees had a lot of connotations for the divine. So did mountains, gardens. So the gods lived on the mountains, they also lived in gardens. And the cosmic tree was sort of what holds everything together, and that has some providential connotations involved with it as well. But you see you've got the little plate of the earth with the ziggurat in the center. You've got the waters, though, all around it. And see, this is where the dome thing starts to take shape. You've got a dome that sort of separates the dish where the flat earth is with the waters on the outside. And then below that, of course, you've got the chaos waters, and then in between is the realm of the dead. This is lifted from Enuma Elish. This is the first 8 lines from the Enuma Elish. We talked about this last week, but I'll just repeat it. Enuma Elish is a Babylonian text because it really sort of lauds the god Marduk, who was the god of Babylon. That was their patron god. So here we have a creation myth that shows how everything came into being, and then eventually what it shows is how Marduk sort of fought and destroyed the chaos dragon and rose to the top and ruled as the head of the gods. So here it is, beginning in verse 1. I'll just read it. When the heavens above, tell me if this sounds familiar. When the heavens above did not exist, and earth beneath had not come into being, there was Apsu. So Apsu got carried forward from Sumerian even into Amorite Babylonian here. The first in order, their begetter. And Demiurge, Tiamat, who gave birth to them all. Tiamat, of course, is the chaos waters monster that Marduk did battle with and destroyed. He destroyed Tiamat, cut her body up, made the heavens with one half of it and the earth with the other half of it. They had mingled their waters together before meadowland had coalesced and reed bed was to be found, when not one of the gods had been formed or had come into being, when no destinies had been decreed. So we talked about Pan-Babylonianism last semester and how it's kind of has a lot of dark stuff attached to it, mainly anti-Semitic views, anti-Jewish connotations to it. One of the things that Pan-Babylonianism had tried to suggest is that everything that we have in the Old Testament is really ripped off from the Babylonians, because the Babylonians were the real deal, and the Jews were a wannabe type of organization, and that the Babylonians had bloodlines from the Aryan race. You see where this is going. But there's a lot of people, even in our own day, that still buy into the Pan-Babylonianism story, that Genesis 1, for example, is a ripoff of the Enuma Elish. Well, I mean, you can kind of see a little bit of that, like when the heavens above did not exist and the earth beneath had not come into being. Conceptually, that sounds like in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. But that's kind of a stretch. And I think a lot of good scholars have done a lot of homework on this and have come to the conclusion that Genesis 1 is really kind of unique of all of the stories of creation in the ancient Near East. Now, there's some similar concepts. You know, you have the motifs in Genesis 1 that you have in these others, but it's unique. And the most unique thing about Genesis 1 is the fact that it's giving you theological information about God, what God did, without exhaustive detail of exactly how did God do that, you know. And there's even a sort of a functionality to it. You could split Genesis 1 into halves. You have 1 through 3, and then you have 4 through 6 on the days. And we'll get into that in a little bit. I think John Walton has a pretty good view. Now, when I mention names, you may even know him, like John Walton. I love John Walton's stuff, but I don't buy into everything he says. There's a lot of people that I will use and reference in these things. That there's hardly anyone that I could buy into everything that they say. But one of the things about these first 3 courses is, as they say, learning how to spit out the bones. So you don't want to throw somebody's entire corpus away because you disagree with them on this one point, but just because you love them on this 2 or 3 points, that you incorporate even the stuff that you have a hard time swallowing. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. But Walton has some wonderful theories about Genesis 1 that I happen to do agree with. Here is a biblical view of cosmology, and everything on here is referenced in an Old Testament scripture. We've got the waters above and the waters below. You remember the firmament language? The Hebrew word is rakia. And the imagery you get with using the word rakia is sort of like, imagine a copper bowl and you're hammering out, sort of like the bowl is shaped in there. That's the word that they used for rakia, the firmament that separates the waters above and the waters below. So basically, the rakia is the one thing where the atmosphere was created, where the birds and the clouds and everything existed. So when you look up at the rakia, you see the stars. You see the sun, you see the moon. Now, above that, you can't see. That's the abode of God. That's where heaven is. And then, of course, that firmament rests on foundations of heaven, which are mountains. And again, I mean, whether you go to Job 37 and 38, you go to Genesis 1, I encourage you to take a look at these texts, because we won't have time to go into all of them tonight. These are not metaphorical descriptions. The Israelites did not think, okay, well, they have the same view as we do about the universe, and they're just using this language as metaphor. No, they really thought this is how the universe was structured. And there's no reason for us to be ashamed of that, because they're not trying to teach us science. They're trying to teach us theological truths. So that's the whole point about this. And one of the things you see down there at the very bottom on the waters, the chaos waters, you see that dragon. There's some of that stuff conceptually, and I'd say probably motif more than anything else, that they did carry from other ancient Near East beliefs. The idea of chaos, I'll repeat it again, is where things are not hospitable for life. If you take a look at the ocean whenever a hurricane's coming through, they would look at that. Nobody can live out there in that. If you take a look at the desert, where there's no vegetation whatsoever, and all the animals that live out there, you have snakes and scorpions and everything else, scavengers. You know, life is very difficult out there too. So the motifs is that they would make a behemoth, for example, is one of them. That was the chaos monster of dry land. And Leviathan is the chaos monster of the sea. And down here, you see that dragon below Sheol. Sheol, of course, is the realm of the dead. If you died, that's where you went. And again, like you walk outside and you see the stars in the heavens and you make your cosmology, whenever you die, what do? They put you in the ground. So underneath the ground is the realm of the dead. Now, they did have a supernatural view, so that doesn't necessarily mean that the supernatural realm had a latitude and a longitude. But conceptually, this is how they viewed things. Any questions so far? Amazing. Well, that's cool. We did talk about Genesis 1 being unique. It is not dependent. That's a good sentence. I'm glad I put slides together. It's not dependent on other ancient Near Eastern stories. Yahweh alone created the world and everything in it. That's also unique. When we get to next week, we'll begin digging into the Old Testament texts. One of the theories on the Old Testament is that the Hebrew people evolved religiously from a polytheistic view that was more commonly held with their neighbors to a monotheistic view. And they actually try to date the Old Testament text based on those assumptions. So they'll look at something that mentions Elohim and they'll date it a little bit older than ones that mention Yahweh. I don't believe in that. I think it's kind of like arguing in a circle. You know what I mean by that? If that's what you're going to assume and you're approaching the text and you date the text, you're basically using your assumptions to date the text, which may be accurate, may not be accurate, but there's no way you can really use your assumptions to prove it. But we'll get into that next time. But the thing that I want to stress here is that if you put that theory aside from the beginning and the very oldest of the biblical text we have, it is monotheistic. It's one of the things that makes the Old Testament very unique from all the others, is that you have one God who is basically sovereign, providentially in control of all the created events and over all the things he created. But at the same time, the ones that he created that had a will, that would be human beings and his supernatural family, he incorporates or brings them along with his decision making in a council type of format. Now, you had a council type of format in ancient Babylon and in the Sumerian culture and the Akkadian, all the other ones too. So that's not unique to the Hebrew Bible. What is unique is its monotheism, and Imago Dei. Is there anybody that doesn't understand what I say when I say Imago Dei? That is the doctrine that we're created in the image of God. We are His image bearers, His representatives in the created order. That is revolutionary compared to all other thought, not just ancient Near Eastern thought. That means that qualitatively and quantitatively, every human being is equal in value, because our value is directly related to the fact that we're image bearers of our Creator. So whether you're on life support, or if you're building or designing a tower in downtown Manhattan, you're of equal value because you're created in the image of God. That is extremely unique for the Hebrew religion. Oh, one more thing. When they looked up at the sky and they saw the stars, follow this logic here, makes a lot of sense. They identified the stars and the heavenly beings, or the heavenly bodies like the moon and the sun, sort of like divine beings. And that the fact that you could count on them and map out their movements across the sky was their obedience to Yahweh, is their obedience to God. So when they looked in the sky and they saw the moon was basically a being that was very obedient to God, in that it followed the same patterns every 30 days. You could create calendars to it. The same thing with the sun. You could create a solar calendar to it. So, it wasn't just sort of like these lifeless balls of gas that are out millions of light years away. These are lights that God had placed in the firmament that obeyed His every command. Does that make sense? Yeah, that's
you can predict most eclipses, but you can't always predict a comet.
Right. Yeah, because they wouldn't have, if they had witnessed one, it'd be like, well, I've never seen that before. Nobody else has heard about them either, because they don't happen except, But yeah, there is also, whether you go to some parts of the Old Testament will talk about the rebellious beings. And I don't know if that's what they would associate with something like a comet or not. But it would make sense, given what I just said, is if these other things were always like clockwork. Well, this thing that's zooming across the sky we've never seen before is a renegade. This comes from Psalm 74. This is, it starts off with their giving God praise for delivering them from Egypt, but then it immediately goes into a creation story. Beginning in verse 12, but God is my king from long ago, He brings salvation on the earth. So he's going back and comparing deliverance from Egypt to how He created the earth, or how He created the universe. It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster, or Tananim, in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. It was you who opened up springs and streams. You dried up the ever-flowing rivers. The day is yours. The night is yours also. You established the sun, the moon. It was you who set all the boundaries of the earth. You made both summer and winter. Things that are regular and regulated and predictable. That's all God. He did that. And that's still true, even at the scientific point of view. It's just that we have a physical explanation for these things. We don't have to guess how that works. If you want to know what our scientific view is, it's how. Why, it doesn't get into. Now, they can't help but bring some whys into it, but if you asked a hardcore materialist science atheist, you would say, do you ever deal with the questions of why or questions of purpose? They would immediately say, absolutely not. That's not the business of science. We're not into purpose and the questions of why. We leave that up to the philosophers. Ours is how. And you can go pretty far with the how explanations for sure, but you never are able to get around or sidestep the fact that you can't talk about them without somehow bringing in, whether you have a disdain for it or not, the whys and the what-fors. I don't want to get off on a long topic on that, but hopefully that made sense. These are some biblical terms that you will find, motifs that are common to home or deep. That's a cousin to, I think, Tiamat and Tahom are cousins linguistically. Tannin or Tananim, dragon or monster of the sea. Leviathan, just to the north in the city of Ugarit, their language is very close to the Hebrew language. Their Leviathan was Litanu, and Litanu was destroyed by Baal, Hadad. And in Psalm 74, we see Yahweh destroying the sea monster Leviathan. That's not an accident, and it's not them ripping him off either. It's a polemic. You guys know what I mean by polemic? It's a criticism. This is what you guys are saying, but this is not how it is. This is how it is. That's what Psalm 74 is doing, and it's juxtaposed with their deliverance from Egypt. So as Yahweh had destroyed Pharaoh and his armies, he also had destroyed the dragon, Leviathan. There is a chaos connection between human evil and these supernatural motifs about chaos and so forth. They're all pretty much comparatively the same family in the ancient or in the Old Testament. Rahav, that is another monster that's mentioned. Psalm 89, Job 9. It's also a sea dragon, but it's also associated with as an enemy or rage, violence, and pride. And then Job 40 talks about Behemoth, the land creature, and that's just a land creature that parallels the sea creature Leviathan. But they're all pretty much chaos monsters. They're something that strikes fear into the hearts and minds of the people who are reading it. So far, so good? So, beginning with Genesis 1, from the ancient Israelite view of creation, I want you to take a look at these different views. You've all heard of them, I'm sure. The young earth view, which believes that Genesis 1 is a literal 6 24-hour days, and that we can somehow, if we are honest with the data, match what we see in the universe to a literal 6 day. In other words, it doesn't take 14 billion years. It can take 6 days to create all that. That's the young earth view. The old earth view sort of does a similar thing. They're still trying to match the biblical data to the scientific data, but instead of it being a literal 6 days, they're saying that the scientific data, mainly the geological and cosmological data, suggests 14 billion years, and that we can map Genesis 1 to that timeline. I'm not fond of either one of these because what's the one common connection between a young earth creationist and an old earth or a day-ager? Trying to map it to science. That is not what's going on in Genesis 1. Nobody up until our own time would have thought Genesis 1 is trying to scientifically explain how the earth was made, how the universe was made. Of course, there are those who say, well, it's just myth, you know. And we've talked about myth. Myth is a tricky word. Myth doesn't necessarily mean it didn't happen. Sometimes myth in proto-historical terms is just a way to try to describe what did happen using language that we would consider mythological language. It doesn't mean that it's fiction. The functional view by Walton here, and I have a couple of Walton's articles on the Dropbox drive, and I really do encourage you guys to read that, but he holds to a functional view of Genesis 1. There are 3 days where God creates space, and then there are 3 days where God fills that space. Does that make sense? And that he actually, the whole idea of the day 4 where he puts the heavenly bodies into the firmament is sort of like God creating a calendar where the feast days could be celebrated. And in fact, Walton goes so far as to say that Genesis 1 is really temple imagery. Just like we saw how the Egyptians tried to form their cosmology around their temple, and so did the Mesopotamians, that Genesis 1 is trying to communicate a message to us that God created the heavens and the earth, and that there is a functional or purposeful reason for the things that he created. This is still very true because, like I said before, that's outside the realm of science. A thing's purpose is not a scientific pursuit. It's just the material and mechanistic explanations for things. Does the Walton view make sense? Like, for example, he created the firmament, and so he separated the waters from the waters and created atmosphere on, was that day 2? And then on day, I'm sorry, folks, I should know this better, but on day 4 or 5, he fills the skies with birds, all the flying creatures. He creates the seas, separates the waters above the firmament from those below, and then he fills the seas. And then, of course, dry land appears, and then what does he do on day 6 is that he fills it full of cattle and creeping things, and then lastly, he creates human beings. So you see there's a connection here between the space that God creates and the things that he fills that space with. You know, birds fly, fish swim, humans and creatures on the earth walk, you know. So there's a nice symmetry there with the way it reads, and I think Walton's on to something. Any questions on Genesis 1 or creation or how the ancient Hebrews viewed cosmology? Because the next one we're going to talk about biology and reproduction, which is, of course, my favorite part. And we're going to use 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 13 through 16 to talk about it. You guys have probably read this and were familiar with it, and you probably thought when you read it, what in the world is this talking about? I mean, I think I know what it's talking about, but there's a lot here. And there is a lot there. But if you lived in the first century, it wouldn't have you would have probably skimmed over it. You would have known exactly how familiar this stuff was. And that's because their view of biology and sexual reproduction is not the same as ours. Let's go ahead and read the text real quick. You judge for yourselves. This is the one where the head covering stuff. You judge for yourselves. Is it fitting for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Akatakaluptos is the word for uncovered there. Verse 14. And does not nature itself teach you that a man, if he wears long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But a woman, if she wears long hair, it is her glory, because her hair is giving as a covering. The word for covering here is parabolion, not akatakaluptos. Different word. But if anyone is disposed to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Matter of fact, inside or outside the church, nobody thinks this way, is what he's saying. So, what does he mean here? What's all this head covering stuff? What does that got to do with everything? Well, overall, what Paul's doing is he's making an argument as an appeal to nature in terms of modesty and gender roles. Because there's a lot of stuff being brought into the church that was very familiar to the Corinthians that they picked up growing up in Corinth. Corinth was the Vegas of the Mediterranean. If you had secrets, you probably created them all in Corinth. So here he is starting a church right in the middle of that hotbed. So you could imagine there's a whole lot of weird traditions coming into the church that he had to pretty much put the brakes on. And that's what's going on here for sure. But what you don't necessarily read in there, if you're a 21st century person, is the fact that he's talking about how men and women reproduce when he talks about their hair. Anybody surprised by that? Most of you, all of you guys may have been in here last time, so none of this is a surprise. But first century people believed that human beings, their hair was a part of their sexual reproductive system. So I'll just give you a brief synopsis of it. Men have short hair because the brain produces semen. And if there's no hair, the semen by gravity falls down. And so when the man and the woman have sexual relations, there's really nothing to keep the semen from staying in the body. Now, that's because the hair follicles that grow out of your head can act like vacuum tubes and pull the semen back into the body, which means that if you're like me and James here, we can't reproduce because our hair is too long. Don't want to put you on the spot, but we're the two guys with the long hair. So at the same time, women want long hair because you want that suction stuff going crazy from the top of your head. So whenever that makes you very viral because then your body can pull in all of that stuff and it could cause you to conceive. This sounds kind of crazy to us, but that is not crazy to them. This is what they believed. And it was taught by Hippocrates and it was taught by Aristotle. There's a paper, and I have it on the Dropbox drive, by Troy Martin. There was a big back and forth between two academic scholars, Troy Martin and Mark Goodacre. I don't have Goodacre's rebuttals in there, but basically they're kind of weak. But Troy Martin, he caught on to this, and he basically wrote this paper that describes what 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is talking about. Listen to how he describes this. This is from his paper on page 77 and 78. Ancient medical conceptions confirm this association. He's talking about hair with reproduction. The Hippocratic authors hold that hair is hollow and grows primarily from either male or female reproductive fluid or semen flowing into it and congealing. Since hollow body parts create a vacuum that attracts fluid, hair attracts semen. Appropriately, the term come refers not only to hair but also to the arms or suckers of a cuttlefish. So it's trying to give you an idea of why they're using that vocabulary. Hair grows most prolificacy from the head because the brain is the place where the semen is produced or at least stored. And that's from Hippocrates. So, okay, if that's not weird enough, check out this fertility test from page 80. Again, this comes from ancient documents. This conception of hair as part of the female genitalia explains the favorite Hippocratic test for sterility in women. A doctor places a scented suppository in the woman's uterus and examines her mouth the next day to see if he can smell the scent of the suppository. If he smells the scent, he diagnoses her as fertile. If he does not smell the scent, he concludes she is sterile because the channels connecting her uterus to her head are blocked. The suction power of her hair cannot draw up the semen through the appropriate channels in her body. The male seed is therefore discharged rather than retained, and the woman cannot conceive. Again, this sounds nuts to us. It wasn't nuts to them. So if we go back and take a look at this again. You judge for yourselves. Okay, you know this now. Now just pretend this is your understanding. Is it fitting for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? And does not nature itself teach you that a man, if he wears long hair, it's a dishonor to him? But a woman, if she wears long hair, it is to her glory because her hair is giving as a covering, paraboleon, which is a Greek word that, among other things, is used for testicle. But if anyone is disposed to be contentious, in other words, if anybody out there doesn't agree with this, they're crazy, because what does he say? We have no such custom anywhere, nor do the churches of God. Does it make more sense now, reading that, knowing how they viewed human reproduction? Now here's the thing. Paul's reference to human reproduction here is scientifically incorrect. We know now that is not how babies are made. We do not have to worry about the length of our hair in order to make babies.
But it was a custom for the Jewish women to have their hair covered.
It was. But he goes...
Is that somehow connected to that?
Could be.
That belief?
It could be. Because really a lot of this stuff, it could have been more widespread. The only ones that I know of that I've read from particularly Martin's paper, is from Hippocrates and Aristotle, which are Greek. But you remember we had a diaspora, and of course they were all probably reading Greek text or understood Greek physiology as well. It's the first time you heard that?
No, it seems like you had alluded to, or somebody had alluded to it in a sermon or something.
Aaron talked about it.
Yeah. So basically, and it could have been me, I don't know. But science and the biology and reproductive system, they basically used agricultural ideas when it talks about reproduction. So the man carries around all the babies inside his body, and he passes I don't know exactly how they pass the babies on to the next male in the family, but basically the males are carrying around the babies. The women are not. They're carrying around the land where the seed will purchase and grow a baby. So it's real simple, if you think about it. Hey, again, never mind. I was going to go.
Tell us.
I was going to say, okay, well, you walk outside and you see, how the universe looks to you, you're going to describe it that way. So they're probably using the same kind of methodology here for reproduction. So they're thinking the man's carrying around the child, and then the woman is just basically the farmland. You plant the seed, and then the baby grows. So that's how come in Hebrews 7, 9, and 10, Levi was still in the loins of his father Abraham. Now I have in here preconception existence, and I don't want to really get into this, but basically, textually, there is nothing that would absolutely condemn the idea of a soul pre-existing its conception. That doesn't mean that it teaches that the soul is eternal. But this is a Heiser thing. He's saying you can't go to any place in the Bible to pretty much destroy the idea or call it heretical. And there were some early Christian fathers that believed in the eternality of the soul. Now, they were condemned in ecumenical councils, but I think the point here is that you might see, or you might be able to point to that in Hebrews 7, 9 through 10. Personally, I kind of think I don't believe that, but it's still kind of a cool thing to think about, because again, the whole point of all these sessions is really, what can the text support? Not what you heard on TV or what your favorite preacher said, but what does the text support? And what does the text not support?
Isn't there kind of the idea of homunculi that are like, they don't know about atoms, so, matter isn't made up of anything else. It's like, matter is whatever it is. Like, dirt is always dirt. At the smallest level, it's always dirt. It's different than water. At the smallest level, water is water. There's no similarity between water and dirt. And therefore, like, humans, at their smallest level, are still humans. Like, they're very small, tiny humans.
Very tiny, yeah.
That was the whole idea. The tiny human needs to come out and grow into a big human.
Right, exactly, yeah. And so, the agricultural motifs are easy to fit or overlay over it, But yeah, I think you're right. Because again, we know better that you actually find common elements in water and dirt. But they didn't know any of that. I mean, who would have thought dirt and water are about as opposite as, fire. Anyway, it's just that you can understand that if you had a pre-scientific understanding of the world, kind of how you came to these conclusions. The other parts of biological understanding in the Bible are also kind of interesting. There is no word for brain in Hebrew. Rosh is usually, it just means the first, but they usually called your head Rosh. Bereshith, bara Elohim, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth. Bereshith has a preposition attached to it, but it's Rosh, Bereshith, Rosh, the beginning. But there's no word for brain. So we know we have an endocrine system and we have a brain and we have a nervous system and all that stuff. They didn't. So they thought the seat of emotions wasn't through that. The heart, Lavav or Lev, is the inner self. And you can map these to concepts that still apply today in a scientific understanding, like heart and will are very similar. The very center of me is my will, my decision-making center. They would call that the heart, the inner self. Your intellect, moral integrity came from your kidneys. The seat of emotions was in your liver and in your intestines. And then, of course, even in the New Testament, in Matthew 9:36 and Luke 15:20, Jesus is moved in his intestines. The Greek word there's splachnizomai. But that's because, actually, think about it. Whenever you're stressed or you're anxious or you're angry or sad, you're feeling it in parts of your body. So they thought, well, that's where the source of those feelings come from, or in these parts of your body. It's wrong. That's not true. But that doesn't mean that...
Emotions can upset your stomach.
They sure can. They sure can.
And I don't know about that, maybe the fact that the kidneys, how that relates to your intellect or your liver.
Well, they had weird stuff like cutting open and reading some sort of interpretation of playing around with internal organs. It's weird stuff from the ancient days, but I don't know if that has any tie into that concept
Or like when
not.
they play, say for an athlete, he's got heart,
Yeah,
playing through his weaknesses.
that's true. But when we say these things, they're more metaphorical than they are anything else. He has heart when he's competing, but he's competing using his muscles and his lungs and and his brain. But the point here is that it's something that would be a mistake to try to take a pre-scientific understanding of biology and for us to try to assume that it wasn't anything more than their literal understanding. That doesn't mean what they're teaching is wrong. It's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If you know that your seat of emotions is not in your intestines, so you're going to ignore everything it says, that's stupid. But at the same time, it's not smart to say, well, this truth that they're teaching is accurate, so therefore maybe there is something to the seat of my emotions coming from my intestines. That's not the right way to go either. Does it make sense? You can't really do either one of those things. You just let it be what it is.
There's overlap too of, like she said, you feel sick in your stomach when you're emotional or something is scary. So we can read that and go, oh, I know what they mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
That just means you don't feel well.
Yeah.
But it takes more work to understand that was
That's what they
literally
thought.
what they meant.
Yeah.
And this is the science of their time.
Yeah. Yeah. Where are we at time-wise? 6:54. Okay. We're going to do a neat little practicum here with Genesis 1 through 3. And I have an article saved on the Dropbox file from Michael Heiser. And a lot of this comes from that article where he goes into a lot more detail. But it has to do with Adam and Eve. Is there a historical Adam and Eve or not? And how does a historical Adam and Eve match up with modern genetic research? Does the science and the theological truth, are they compatible in any way? There had been a lot of hoo-ha back right before 2010 where they discovered that it's impossible. They looked at our genetic patterns, and I'm not a geneticist, so I'm talking way out of school here, but somehow they can trace back similarities and sort of kind of figure out whether or not human beings can be traced to a single pair of other people or not. And they determined, genetically speaking, they could not, that our genetic makeup comes from a whole bunch of different original moms and dads. So it can't be tied to a single parent. And so the whole thing was, well, if that's true, then what do we do with Genesis 2 and 3? And so, of course, you can imagine in that kind of situation, there's a whole lot of gerrymandering with the text on the scientific side and on the theological side that goes in wrong directions. But it is still a good exercise to think through it. And so a lot of what Heiser's article does is actually do that, thinks through it. So what does the text actually say about Adam and Eve, and what does it not say? And how does it relate to our ideas? You know, where does evolution fit into this? How does genome research that we understand now fit into it? And how does that impact theological issues such as sin and death? Those are the big ones. There's a guy out there named Joshua Swamidass. He is very well respected in the scientific community. He also loves Jesus. Now, Joshua Swamidass believes in evolution, okay? But Joshua Swamidass also believes in a genealogical Adam and Eve. He doesn't believe in a genetic Adam and Eve. He believes in a genealogical Adam and Eve. So what's the difference between the two of those things? Well, you get half of your genetic data from your mother and half of your genetic data from your father. You get 25% of it from your maternal grandma. It's a mathematical equation, and you can go back and back and back and back and back. Well, you can go back far enough to where you have no genetic material or genomic material that you've inherited from these ancient people that you are related to. And once more, you're not just related to a man and a woman from way back. You're related to thousands upon thousands of men and women from the past. If you wanted to do the mathematics of it, it's real simple. It's 2x, where x is the generation. You can kind of figure out the number of people that you're related to depending on how many generations you want to go back. So if you wanted to do 30 generations, that's a big number. You see what I'm saying? You can also work backwards from that too. So what Swamidass does is from a and then we're talking genealogy here, not genetics. What Swamidass says is that yes, all humanity can be tied to a single mom and dad, but it's done genealogically, not genetically. If you go back 6,000 years, you can tie all of humanity to a single man and woman. You could go back another 6,000 years and do the same thing. So here's what Swamidass is saying. And he's not saying this is how you need to interpret Genesis 2 and 3. What he's saying is that scientifically you can match them up. You can declare that humanity comes from a single man and a single woman and not conflict with the science. All right? That doesn't necessarily mean that's exactly how it happened. What he's trying to do is he's trying to show from a very and let me tell you, there are atheist scientists who agree with Swamidass. They say he's right. There's no flaws in his logic. But let's say that's true. We think of Adam and Eve as the progenitors of all human beings. So how does that fit with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2? How does that fit with the Imago Dei? And there are a lot of theories that you could go down and you're going to hit a dead end for more than one bad reason. For example, well, let's just hold off on that. I have non-Adamic race theology. You get into some very incredibly racist theories here because then you obviously you've got, well, these people are descendants from Adam and these people were not in the garden. They were created, but they're non-Adamic people. You see where that could go. So that's kind of a dangerous place to end up because then you just destroy the Imago Dei, the truth of being created in the image of God. You now have qualitative differences. Does that make sense? And we don't want to go there. Evolution. Can evolution be theologically compatible with the Bible? I think the first answer to that question is that it doesn't matter because no one who wrote the Bible understood evolution, didn't even know what it was. They just were providing theological truths inspired by God's Spirit that God created everything. How he did it, how long it took him to do it, we can bicker about that, but that's not what the author of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 are trying to get at. Now, personally, for me, I'll just go ahead and say this. I think there are aspects of evolution that you can see. It would be foolish to deny evolution as a theory. I mean, we've just gotten the other side of COVID-19. How many of you read enough of it where you started to learn about how viruses and bacteria can adopt to get around vaccines and the immune system? And they're smart. They learn how to grow and survive. So there are aspects of evolution that just absolutely are brilliant, and they are empirically seen in the world. Now, the grand story, that bats and sponges share a common ancestor, I think that's anecdotal, not scientific. It doesn't mean it ain't true. I'm just saying that once you start saying that all life comes from a single source of life from 5 billion years ago, or whatever it is, I think you're getting anecdotal at that point. You're trying to take what you know to what you don't know and fill in the blanks in between. So, that's not necessarily what I'm saying is what you should think too. It's just where I'm at. A lot of people don't want to tell you where they're at on stuff. I'll tell you where I'm at. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not smart enough to say that grand story of evolution is false. But I got a brain, and I do have this whole idea of, if I wanted to know, at what temperature water boils, there's a specific test you can do, and you can come up with a real answer. When you want to know how bats and sponges are related to each other, I don't think you can do that. I think you have to make a whole bunch of assumptions. The farther you go back, the more assumptions you got to tack onto it. That doesn't mean that it's not true. I'm just saying you're going beyond measuring the temperature where water boils. You're getting an anecdote. Does that make sense?
Bats and sponges?
Yeah.
Something like a bat, like an animal?
Yeah.
A sponge, like a
Yeah.
sponge you clean with? Okay.
If you believe in the grand story of evolution, those two things came from a common ancestor.
Before, actually, plants, too. Plants and sponges branched off, and then sponges branched into bats. That was the...
Oh, yeah.
Sponges are animals in the...
Oh, that's true. That's right. Yeah. Sponges.
So it's kind of funny, that whole, tree. But one of the things I was going to say is it's important to remember in any science is that it is based on what we see and can test, like what you said. And anything outside of that is an extrapolation.
Yep.
Just like the weather report is very accurate for tomorrow, a little less accurate for the day after. It's very poorly accurate once you get to 11 days out.
Mm-hmm.
It can go the same way. I mean, there are evidences of theories that, you can look at the strata of geological activity and all sorts of things, but even in these theories and ideas brought forward, the further back you go, the further forward you go, the room for error is, it's like, oh, well, it's just another million years, it's like, oh, it's between 5 and 7 million years. Well, that's a million-year difference, versus...
That's where the term...
way out there, and when it's close, it's very easy to...
Your confidence level is a whole lot...
You're precise enough for humans that you feel like you know 100% what the answer is, but that's where modern science is right now, trying to figure out the little bits that most people don't even care about because it's way too precise for their daily lives. But even then, it's the same level. It's extrapolating to the smallest. It's extrapolating in every direction, and the more you extrapolate, the more assumptions you have to make, and the more trust you have to have in the basis that you built.
And it can't be reproduced.
Well, yeah, you can't reproduce.
You know what I'm saying? Doesn't a theory have to be able to be proved?
Repeatable. Yeah, a repeatable. That's part.
Scientific theory.
Yeah, and you can't repeat the past.
No.
You could try to recreate it. And they've tried to do that. You know, I've heard of trying to create an early Earth atmosphere and try to see if they could see an amino acid pop into
they've
existence.
electrified, things, and you try to get it so that there's amino acids are one, and bubbles of, like, I think microbubbles is the big deal because it's a spontaneous alignment of molecules that create basically the cell wall that's used to, then things live in the cell wall, and the more compound things that are made, you get
Bubbles are formed, then bubbles don't pop, and then things grow in the bubble.
mitochondria living in it, and mitochondria is one of the ways they trace back the genealogy for
Yeah,
this thing. They trace back the matrilineal line. Your mother passes on mitochondria, and you can trace your matrilineal line. So they trace it back to a genealogical Eve. Is one of the
that's
one
right.
of the ways that they tried to trace and prove that, well, there's only so much mitochondria in the world, so many variations, and if we take it to 2 to the x power, we can find, it's one of the young Earth theories that people try to figure out, like, where
Salvage
the
it.
mitochondrial Eve was from. And
Yeah.
There's a lot to it.
Swamidas gets into that, and I was you're talking about mitochondrial DNA or maternal DNA. He does talk about a lot of that stuff. I wish it's a book, if you guys, I think it's called In Search of the, just look up Joshua Swamidas. I don't want to butcher up the title. Panspermia, you guys ever heard of that? This is your History Channel, Ancient Aliens Theories. That aliens came to the Earth years ago and genetically modified primates and created humans to be slaves to mine gold. Now, I mean, I'm being facetious here because that is a theory that these guys have, but there are legitimate scientists that do wrestle with the question, did some life forms in some manner or fashion crash to Earth on an asteroid or something and jumpstart life on Earth? That theory they would call it panspermia. And if they did it here, they did it in other parts of the universe as well. Well, okay, let me just repeat myself. I was being facetious by bringing up the ancient aliens, but like there are scientists that are, and you know what? If I was an atheist, I would be thinking, okay, well, if there's no God, how did it all get here? And are we alone in the universe? And that would make I don't know if it seems logical. Yeah, it is. It does seem that way.
To the asteroid theory is that it deposited some sort of like material that wasn't on the young Earth that
sort of
was a unique
Kick-started it.
combination. Like it's about as likely as saying any other random origin you want to come up with, but like it's not with intelligent design from ET. It's just from a rock instead of lightning. Like
yeah.
Lightning's the other one that it energized the atmosphere and like created these micro bubbles.
Yeah, that's the amino acid one too, I think.
Yeah.
So basically, going back to the Bible here is you're not going to find the answers to those questions there. They're just not there. Moses didn't understand evolution. The editors that came back behind Moses didn't understand it either. So let's start with a comparison of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and then we'll try to wrap it up best we can here. So are there two creation stories of humans or one? Has anybody read that or thought of that before? Genesis 1? Okay. Well, this is Genesis 1, 26 through 28. And God said, "Let us make humankind in our image and according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of heaven, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every moving thing that moves upon the earth." So God created humankind in his image. In the likeness of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens and over every animal that moves upon the earth. All right, I'm going to ask you a question. What are things that you do not see in this text?
God making Adam.
Right? There's just humanity, right? There's no
I don't think
specifics.
humankind is plural.
It is. Well, I mean, it's presumed. The word itself isn't, but them is plural.
Yeah.
You're right. There are no two specific people named in this. What else is missing? Is there a garden in here? Is there even the mention of a garden in here? Okay, now let's go to Genesis 2, beginning in verse 4. These are the generations of heaven and earth when they were created in the day that Yahweh God made earth and heaven. Before any plant of the field was on the earth, and before any plant of the field had sprung up, because Yahweh had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was no human being to cultivate the ground, but a stream would rise from the earth and water the whole face of the ground. When Yahweh God formed the man of dust from the ground, he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and he became a living creature. And Yahweh planted a garden in Eden in the east, and there he put the man whom he had formed. You can see how people would say, these are not the same stories. So the question is what do we do with it? See, we have a garden here, and notice the garden is not the whole world. It's not even Eden. It's a garden in Eden in the east, so it's a part of Eden. It has latitude and longitude, and it's limited to that latitude and longitude. And he placed man in that garden. Here's another thing. In chapter 1, human beings were created after plants. But in chapter 2, there were no plants because God hadn't created a human being to cultivate the ground. Now you could say, well, they're talking about agricultural plants. I don't know. I think that's kind of stretching it myself. If you're really going to wrestle with this text, let's just read what's in it. And what's in it says that on Genesis 2, that there were no plants until humans showed up. And in Genesis 1, there were plants, then there were humans. So here's some ideas of how it has been handled. Interpret Genesis 1 and 2 as the same story. That the humans in Genesis 1, 26 to 28, are the same humans in Genesis 2 and 3. But you run into some problems with that. I don't have the text here, but Genesis 4:14 through 15 and 17. This is Cain. Everyone's heard of the first one. It's real famous. Cain has a wife. Well, where in the world does she come from? And of course, their answer is, well, it was his sister. Because back in those days, and then you get a modern scientific explanation overlaid on top of the text to try to explain something that's difficult. That's what we're trying to get people to stop doing. Because I think when you get to the truth and wrestle with the text the way it is, you come up with better answers, even if they can't be 100% confident answers. The other one I think is even greater problem is that Cain is cursed. God says, you're going to be a renegade, basically. And Cain says, my punishment is too severe because people are going to notice me and they're going to kill me. Well, who are these people that he's worried about? Where did they come from? And then he goes and he builds a city, Enoch, named after his son. Did he build the whole city by himself? Or did he have a son and wait till his son, and so him and his son built the whole city by himself?
And why are you building a city if there's just like 4 people?
Right. You don't need a city. That's an excellent question. Excellent question. So if you're going to look at the humans in Genesis 1 and in Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 as the same story, you got some splaining to do when you get to Genesis 4. Okay, well, what's the second choice? Interpret Genesis 1 and 2 as two separate stories of human creation. Well, that fixes the problem of Genesis 4 because you can have God creating humans outside the garden, and you can have God creating Adam and Eve and putting them inside the garden. Then you have another question that follows up with that. Well, are they the same? Do they all have the image of God? And how does that work? How do the humans outside the garden theologically sort of mesh with those inside the garden? Some of those questions are...
The ones that he created inside the garden, Adam and Eve, be like who he picked, like Abraham. He just randomly
Yep.
picked somebody and said, boom, this is who I'm going to.
That's right.
Or
Yeah.
it's the story of his people.
Yeah.
It's a
The
continuing
starting,
yeah.
the starting of the story of his people.
Now, that's a very good possibility. I'm bringing up another name where there's a lot of bones to spit out, but he's got some good ones too. Peter Enns. He looks at Adam as a metaphor for Israel. So God's elective choice with Israel is represented in Genesis 2 as God's elective choice for Adam. But he goes too far, I think. He goes too far than I would go. He pretty much denies that, or that it's important that there is a historical Adam and Eve. I think it is. I don't think you could read the text and say that it's not important. Question is how do you explain it? The article that I have from Heiser that goes over this stuff is taking Genesis 1 through 3 at face value. Is it compatible with recent genome research? And of course, that last step here is there's a couple articles between Peter Enns and G.K. Beale over this whole issue about metaphorical stuff versus, or was it just pure myth? Is it just metaphor, or is there some real history here? But if you go too far and you make Adam and Eve and the whole creation event mythical in the fictional sense, what does that do to the Imago Dei? What does that do with us being valuable because of our being created in the image of our Creator? Is that myth too? Did you know, and I am open to anybody that can show me an alternative to the doctrine of Imago Dei from any thought system out there that provides a reason for human beings being valuable. That kind of sounds crazy. You know what I'm saying though? If we hold that human beings are valuable because they're created in the image of God, it doesn't matter whether we hate them or love them. They're dangerous or they're not dangerous. They are created in the image of God just like I am. What's the alternative to that? And if you think that it's easy for us to automatically live our lives like the Imago Dei is how we are going to treat other people, guess again. All you got to do is disagree with somebody politically, and they're qualitatively and quantitatively less human than you are. It's very easy to go down that slippery slope. So what it could lead to is nihilism, or a very thoroughly, logically consistent atheism where nature is red in tooth and claw. It's like Alexander the Great said when they asked him, who's going to take over your empire? And he says, the strongest one. It goes against all the scriptural witness to denigrate or alleviate the Imago Dei. Well, what do you know? I did have it up here. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch, and when he built a city, he named it after his son Enoch. I love that question. Who's going to live in it? So here's the next question. You get to Genesis 3 in the fall. If you've got two creation events, then how does Christian theology wrestle with the whole doctrine of sin and salvation? Are the people outside the garden sinful? Or is it just the people inside? Or is redemption offered to just them? Those are the questions that could easily be raised. And the text that really sort of hinges on a lot of it is Romans 5:12. That through one man, sin came into the world, and through sin, death, And since then, all die because all sin. How does that fit into this idea of two creation stories? It can. Now think about it. If the Garden of Eden, now this is something that we'll get in the supernatural course, Unseen Realm 1. The Garden of Eden was God's throne room. Not too much teaching on that. But the Garden of Eden is where God resided. God decided He was going to live with His creation in the Garden of Eden, just like He lived in the temple, in the Holy of Holies, in Israel. So everything in the garden was really remarkably, qualitatively and quantitatively better than outside of it. But God said in Genesis 1 that everything He created outside the garden is good. Okay? So, you've got the story of Adam and Eve who distrust God. They're banished from the garden. But if there's two creation stories, all they're doing is going outside the garden where everybody else already is. You see?
They're separated from God outside the garden.
They're separated from God outside the garden. That's the key, is that Adam and Eve, the biggest difference between Adam and Eve is that they were with God in the garden. They were ruling and reigning with Him as a part of His counsel, His human counsel. The people outside weren't. And because of their disobedience, now they were just like them. So it's sort of like if you think you could do a better job than Adam, you probably wouldn't. He was probably the best representative that we had. But nonetheless, that means that sin is universal with two creation event stories for humans. And it makes Romans 5:12 work. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Does that make sense? Now, okay, well, what's the problem with it? I have one problem with the text in making that two-story thing fit. And it's Romans 5:12 again. Through one man, sin entered the world. I'm not saying this because I actually really do agree a lot with what Heiser's saying. I just don't think that there is a silver bullet for us. If through one man, sin entered the world and death through sin, was there no sin outside the garden? Were these people sinless? Because it's pretty technical where it says through one man, Adam. I don't know the answer to that. And there's a whole lot more to, I think, research. The thing that I'm trying to do through this example here is, first of all, let you know that you don't have to be afraid of Scripture in terms of letting it be what it is, even with modern science as something that you have in your head. But to also study it and actually work at it. Embrace the ambiguity and don't try to turn it into dogma when it's not dogma, it's ambiguity. But at the same time, don't stop with the ambiguity. Keep digging. God, what does it say in James chapter 1? If you pray for wisdom, God's going to give it to you. I think that if you're just not going to be satisfied with the ambiguity, I think God will honor that effort. Now, I talk about a flood here. We don't get into it as much as Adam and Eve. But can the text support a local or regional flood? And the answer is that it can. Now, again, that does not mean that it was. I wasn't there. But if you're going to meet somebody that tells you that the Bible doesn't support a regional or a local flood, then they haven't really looked into it very well. The Hebrew words that are used in Genesis chapter 8, verse 9a, is waters were still on the face of all the earth. Kol haaretz is the words for all the earth. You can go to other texts in the Bible using the exact same words, kol and whatever the other subject will be. And you'll find one here in Joel chapter 2, verse 28. Now I need to fix that. And it will happen afterward, thus I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Kol nefesh? I think it's nefesh. But it's the same language that's used in Genesis 8:9? Well, obviously, God did not pour out His Spirit on all flesh. He pours out His Spirit on those who place their confidence in Christ in the New Testament, and they're looking forward to this in the Old Testament. So to say that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh means that every human being the Spirit's poured out on. I think we could pretty much conclude there's people out there that really don't want anything to do with God. So there is a perfect example of a scriptural text where all is used and it doesn't mean all. It means some. So you could take that and apply that also to Genesis 8:9a and say that it wasn't all the earth, it was part of the earth. And you would be textually justified in doing so. Again, that doesn't mean that it was a global flood or a regional or local flood. What it does mean is that it could be either one of those things and your theology is fine. You don't have to call somebody a heretic because they believe in a regional flood. And that happens, unfortunately, too much. Questions with that? Summing this up, the intention of the biblical writer was not to teach science. The writer didn't understand modern science or know anything about it. And guess what? God knew that, and it didn't bother him one bit. Scientific accuracy doesn't determine the truth of a non-scientific teaching. Not all truth is scientific truth. You can let the Bible be what the Bible is without worrying about its veracity. Any interpretive theories offered where ambiguity exists are valued based on whether the text can support it. That's the question you'd ask is, can the text support this idea or not? So the last part of this thing, and I'll try to keep this as brief as I can, is truth, relativism, and the art of spitting out the bones. We've talked about history, we talked about literary context, we've talked about science in the Bible. So you put all this stuff together, and what we're going to do now is start talking about, okay, how do I approach the Bible and think well about it? And are there some principles to keep in mind in it in doing so? Oh, by the way, if you guys were curious, Venn diagram here, you know what the purple is? Is it purple up there? That's where you're right, but accidentally. You ever heard of justified true beliefs? Or it's a big philosophical thing in epistemology, but you could be accidentally right. That's what that purple means. Okay, truth and relativism. Relativism is the doctrine that knowledge, truth, and morality exist in relation to culture, society, or historical context and are not absolute. What's right for one person is not right for the other, or one group of people in time is not the same as another group of people in another time. Cultural relativism, same thing, but applied to culture. Norms, traditions, institutions, concepts, perspectives are relative to culture, either contemporaneous or epochal. All right, well, I'll give you a biblical example. We talked about the trial by ordeal in Numbers 5, where they had the woman accused of adultery drinking dirty water to see if her stomach will swell. That is something that would have been typical to them because it's trial by ordeal, but it would be weird to us. And then objective morality. Moral claims of right and wrong, good and evil, are universally true and absolute. So if you strip out all of the cultural baggage on it, things like fratricide, adultery, bestiality, theft are always wrong. Self-sacrifice, compassion, generosity, faithfulness are always good. What is a good test for truth? Logical consistency. Does it make sense? Empirical adequacy. Can I observe this in the real world? Experiential or existential relevance. Does it have anything to do with me? Revelatory truth is a little different because you receive revelation, you don't derive it. But it doesn't necessarily conflict with those three tests above. It also doesn't rely on it either. Revelatory truth coming externally from God, that is. Okay, so here's the problem. If you've got some cultural baggage in the Old Testament, like trial by ordeal, how do you know how to separate out you could just as easily say, well, you know what, that seemed like it was a good thing for them, but we wouldn't even think about doing that now. So the Bible's relative. It's got relative cultural values in it, even between Old Testament and New Testament. All right? Now that's a very popular, you'll hear that a lot. And so how do you separate that out? And I think it goes back to what I said about objective morality. Is morality itself objective or subjective? Are there some things that are absolutely wrong no matter what age you live in or what culture you live in? And are some things absolutely good for the same reasons? And the answer is yes. That doesn't mean there isn't any such thing as subjective moral truths. But if you do that, they can always be boiled down to cultural differences. So what has been done in the past, and in particularly, I think it was done marvelously by Thomas Aquinas. He basically read Aristotle and decided, Aristotle knew what he was talking about. And so the two things that Aristotle talked about and Aquinas brought in through a Christian perspective are two ideas, natural law and essentialism. Now, you'll go into some circles these days, and these two words, natural law and essentialism, will get you labeled as a homophobe or a racist or there's a lot of bad names. Most people don't even know what they mean. Some people that see essentialism probably think of the guy who wrote the book about getting rid of all the things you don't need in your house. Natural law basically informs our morality. Acorns grow into trees, not cats. You don't plant cats in the backyard and expect an oak tree to grow out of it. That's kind of a ridiculous example. I like to throw ridiculous examples in for some reason. But here's one that's not so ridiculous. Families are based around the fact that it takes a man and a woman to make more people to replace the old ones that die, and it takes approximately 18 years to rear those people. The whole concept of the family is forged by these natural, biological, and sociological facts that don't change. Now, there's some changes, and we'll get into what those are. But nobody just decided as a king, I'm going to create this idea of the family and define what that is. We already knew what families were before somebody got ideas like that. Before there was even this huge top-down idea, families were just naturally evolved or came about. But what does that do, though? I mean, it obviously points beyond itself. Nature points beyond itself. And what Aquinas would say is that nature points beyond itself to God. That God is the explanation for nature. Particularly, he wouldn't limit it to just purpose and beauty and design. He would say every aspect of nature can point to God, a transcendent God. But that would be part of it too. It's like when you notice things in nature that are clearly telling you the way something is supposed to work, that automatically begins to transcend that set of circumstances in the physical world by itself. There's something else going on there. And that was Aristotle's point. His was the unmoved mover. It was all in his definition of movement wasn't the same as what you'd think of, but Aristotle's was like setting something in motion, and then things come out. I don't want to get too deep into that, but things have potential, and potential reveals essential attributes of something that makes it what it is, which leads to essentialism. It's the essence of someone or something, and it's the total essential properties or attributes that person has. You could take a dog and cut off its leg and it's still a dog. That's essentialism. I know, it's a terrible example. You didn't cut the leg off, you just see the dog with 3 legs.
Okay, that sounds better.
Is that a dog or not? I would never cut a leg off a dog. We'll edit that out. But a dog with 3 legs is still a dog, and a 50-year-old man is not a rabbit. That's not actually stepping outside the bounds of ridiculousness too much these days. But essentialism is basically common sense. You know, there are some things on the margins that are difficult to discern, but by and large, nature works a particular way, always has. Biology's still biology. We just don't know more about it and how it works. And essentialism is like we understand things to be what they are, and not based on how we want them to be, but how they actually are.
Both of these, natural law in particular, kind of run into a problem that if nature points beyond itself to God, that kind of suggests that nature is good, which then suggests some uncomfortable
Yeah,
aspects of nature have to be good that we would consider evil, but they have to be good because they're pointing to God.
yes. And you see that in history. You see people that have taken natural law and abused it for their own benefit. The slave trade. There's all kinds of different aspects of the slave trade, or even we used to treat women horribly, and we would use natural law as an excuse for doing things like that. Well, you know, it's true. You take something that's true, and then you would take it beyond its usefulness, and you're using it to exploit for your own gain. For example, in general, men are stronger than women. Now, you're going to find a Bobby Riggs out there who's not as strong as Billie Jean King. Now, that's not done on accident, by the way. But for the most part, men are stronger than women. But you could take that and abuse that. And they have done that in the past. And, you know, the thing is that that's why a lot of people don't like even hearing these words, because that's what they think it will automatically lead to, is that if we revive a natural law theory or an ontology of essentialism, that we're going to wind up digging up all of these ghosts from the past and bringing up all kinds of evils that we thought we had long time buried. Well, you know what? That might even be true, but it ain't because of these theories. It's because of us. It's because of sin. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
It kind of means that you almost have to define what is natural, and just because something's widespread, it's not natural.
Yeah.
Then you have to kind of pick apart stuff that is widespread and figure out whether it's natural or not.
Yeah, when you start getting into things that are less than obvious, because a lot of this stuff is just, you know, Thomas Reid is a Scottish philosopher who wrote a thing. A lot of it was just, he would call it common sense. You don't have to go to college to know a three-legged dog is a dog. But there are other aspects of it too, where are probably more on the periphery, where, you know, it does take a little bit more thought into it, and careful thought. But the point behind natural law and essentialism, those are big words, but basically you guys know what I mean. I think common sense is a good word for it. But that's also how you learn how to cross cultural and cross-temporal commonality in laws and codes. For example, 1 Corinthians 11, 13 through 16 has an incorrect understanding of human reproduction, but it has a correct teaching about modesty and gender roles. And what is he using? Phusis, nature. And he says there's no one, either inside the church or outside the church, who believes differently than this. Genesis 1, God created everything for good, regardless of what we discover scientifically about it. Human value universally is based on imaging our Creator, and there are no other alternatives to that. Trying to remember exactly the point I was trying to make with bringing Genesis 1 into this. But Numbers 5, trial by ordeal, we talked about this, the test of drinking dirty water to find out the truth about infidelity. It doesn't make any sense to us, but adultery is bad for a peaceful, flourishing society. I don't think that our opinions about adultery have changed, even though the ways that we deal with it have changed. But how do we determine those things? How do you go through there and filter out the cultural stuff that doesn't pertain to us for the eternal stuff that does pertain to us? And I'm not trying to describe something you didn't already know. Everybody does this anyway. All I'm doing is just talking about it out loud. Is that we know these things because there are some things that are the same for them that there are for us, and there's ways that we can interpret what they're trying to teach us, even if they got a lot of cultural baggage on top of that. It involves effort. Biblical interpretation involves effort. Does anybody believe that it doesn't? Let the text speak for itself. Embrace ambiguity when you see it. You know, sometimes I think as Christians, we're not supposed to be ambiguous about what we just read. We need to know exactly what it says. Then we go to the commentary, which is about as technologically up to date as an 8-track tape. And just try to fill in the blanks. Understand, this is the point, last point before we go. Understand that you too have a cultural context. There are things that we do in our culture that seem perfectly normal to us that are weird. It's just the truth. And be able to bracket your own prejudices and background from what the text is actually telling you. Which leads me to two of the biggest problems in biblical interpretation is that we have a very hard time, this is difficult, taking yourself outside your own cultural context. You know, these were written by shepherds, farmers, miners, there's soldiers. Life was not easy. It was hard. You worried, when you were in a family in Mesopotamia, you worried of war, being captured as a war slave. You worried about starving to death. Will you have any food? Will there be no crops? You worried about dying of disease. I mean, you could die from mosquito bites. Life was not easy. It took also a lot of enormous physical dedication. You probably, if you saw any fat people in the ancient world, it's because they had it pretty good. Because you did not get up in the morning and go to bed at night without blood, sweat, and tears in that world. So the concept of justice and morality in general is centered more on survival than anything else. And so it would seem most natural for people, whether they're in Israel or outside of Israel, to trust their deity far more than we would today. And so you see society and culture and religious forms and laws and codes all surrounding these realities of a very hard, difficult life. But that's not us. Nature hasn't changed, we have. And we have been alienated from nature through enormous cumulative wealth and technological advancement. Our concerns are more detached from nature than ever before. So experientially, we cannot relate to the first century writer or the Iron Age writers. I mean, if our broadband drops, our HVAC goes out, you're going to hear about it. The hardest we work is sitting at a desk for a 40-hour work week. Why do you think gyms have memberships? It's kind of like we have to join a gym because we can't just sit at our desks and work 40 hours a week and stay healthy. All of our information centrally coordinated and disseminated, the information that we're supposed to believe. Now, the other information that doesn't match the centrally disseminated information is heretical, but you get what I'm being tongue-in-cheek here, but you know what I'm getting at there. You can have 4 different kinds of milk in your latte, and you're going to talk about it if you don't get the right milk. We don't have to worry about dying from mosquito bites, but we still have to worry about cancer and heart disease. See, that's the one thing about nature. I love Joe Walsh's song, Life's Been Good. No, not Life's Been Good. What's the other song? Nature has its little surprises. This is a surprise of nature, is that there are trade-offs. If you create a medicine, there are going to be side effects you did not expect. And then you're going to make a medicine for those side effects. And guess what? There's going to be side effects that you did not expect. So here we are in a world where we don't have to worry about mosquito bites, but we worry about cancer and heart disease. I don't think we are so coddled that our concept of trade-offs offends us. But we can't get around it. So what am I getting at here? Everything that we consider and take for granted is all contingent on a stable power grid. That power grid goes, so does all of our culture. And all of a sudden, we're back to where we were. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that you need to pay me $10,000 and I'll put in a bomb shelter in your backyard. What I am telling you is this is real, and it's easy to forget that. Now, we also suffer from functional deism. We're Christians, right? We believe in God. But we believe in creation, the virgin birth, and the resurrection. That's all the supernatural stuff we want to deal with. If you bring up any more than that, we're going to tell you you probably need to take it easy and keep your mouth shut for a while because you're getting weird. But every page of the Bible is cram-packed with the supernatural elements in it. So what do? We selectively accept the supernatural aspects of Scripture while denying or ignoring the others. Genesis 6, 1 through 4, the sons of God and the daughters of humans. Psalm 82, the condemnation of the gods and God's divine counsel. We will come up with an anti-supernatural human explanation for these texts. And there are no natural explanations for these texts. So between the fact that we lose track of where we are culturally, how good we have it, and the fact that we are isolated or alienated from nature itself, and the fact that whether we want to admit it or not, we have been affected by secularism and deism, if you want to call it that, to the point that we bring it even into our exegesis into Scripture. Those are things that we have to learn how to bracket and put aside, whenever we're going to the text to let it tell us what it's saying. So overall, what I'm talking about is thinking well, because truth by its very nature is exclusive. The context of the writers of Scripture are not ours, and ours are not theirs. That there is a commonality, call it natural law, call it whatever you want, that's common. If it wasn't common, we wouldn't be able to read the Bible and understand any of it. Recognize how secular and anti-bias against the supernatural can even color an evangelical understanding of Scripture. You don't have to go very far to find it. Also, this is part of our secularism. Scientific truths do not make the clear teaching of Scripture obsolete, because not all truth is scientific truth. Scientific truth is one form of truth. And I can't say this enough, embrace ambiguity. If you don't understand it, that's okay. That means you have an adventure to go on, and you're going on it with God. So embrace those things. You much rather go through that whole process than you would just trying to paper over it with something that's probably wrong. Let the Bible be, these are Heiserisms, let the Bible be what it is, and not try to make it what it's not. If it's weird, it's important. Don't ignore the weird stuff. And always remember that you have an essential connection to the text, which is God's Spirit. Not too bad, 7:49. It's not 9:30 like I told you. Do we have any questions? Did that last part about being alienated from nature make sense? What did I have it up there about somebody complaining about soy milk in their... Yeah, okay. Just imagine some farmer who had no crops, in the 25th century BC, listening to you, assuming he can understand what you're saying, arguing with a barista about how they screwed up your coffee. That kind of puts it in perspective, what I'm talking about here.
Everybody loves time travel movies.
Yeah, that's right.
Back to the Future or whatever, when you just, the ridiculousness of not understanding the culture based on what you're used to.
Even Biff would be like, wow.
You're arguing over soy milk and raw honey, and they're like, I'm dreaming of the land of milk and
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, thank you guys for your patience. Don't leave. Next week, we're going to get into the text. We're going to get into the Old Testament, and then from here on out, we're going to get into the weeds. If you like weeds, this is your thing. If you don't like weeds, the legal weeds, come anyway. But thank you guys. God bless. You're welcome.